friends. I'm Doug Pratt, welcoming you to the Life Academy. Our topic of this Pastor's Roundtable is Jihad and the Jews. It's a vitally relevant topic in the year 2024 and beyond. The undercurrent of hatred, rivalry, suspicion, and violence that has been simmering for more than 7 decades in the Middle East exploded in October 2023. Without warning or immediate provocation, a large force of radical Islamists known as Hamas burst out of hiding places and tunnels in the Gaza Strip and invaded southern Israel. They rampaged through communities, raping, killing more than 1,000 and taking hundreds of hostages. The proud and fierce Israeli army was caught off guard. An immediate retaliatory invasion of Gaza by the Israelis began. Thousands of non-combatant civilians and likely thousands of Hamas soldiers and sympathizers have been killed. A humanitarian crisis has erupted. Some hostages have been released, but others are still held or dead. The conflict has rippled across the Middle East, with attacks by the Iran-backed groups Hezbollah in Lebanon and Houthis in Yemen. The American political leaders have been divided about whether and how to support Israel, and numerous protests and riots by Hamas sympathizers have broken out on campuses and in cities across America as well as in Europe. The radical Muslims proclaim they are engaging in a jihad or holy war to eliminate the state of Israel and all Jews. Well, joining me for this Pastor's Roundtable is Dr. Stephen Grant, who has significant experience and expertise in understanding the complexities of the Middle East. Stephen, tell us about your experiences traveling in Israel and give us an understanding of the geography and the politics of that portion of the world.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you, my brother. And this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, as I have had the privilege and the opportunity to visit the state of Israel on 15 separate occasions. 8 times I've led groups from our church, and then the 7 other times were solo trips, and sometimes by myself, sometimes accompanied by my wife, with my wife Nanette. And I've had the pleasure, the joy of meeting and getting to know many people of all sorts, some of whom have remained dear friends. And as Israel is a very diverse country, my friends and acquaintances have included Christians and Muslims and Jews, and even a few Druze. A lot of people haven't learned who the Druze are, but they're there as well, and some Bedouins. Now, these have included, my friends, religious leaders, leaders of civic organizations, people who are committed to the reconciliation and understanding, members of the press and publishing houses. I've had the privilege of meeting some folks from the Israeli Defense Forces, business people, academics, particularly from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And not to mention many ordinary citizens, including residents of kibbutzim. Now, to understand all of these people are respectively from both Israel itself as well as from Judea and Samaria. And by the way, when I make reference to Judea and Samaria, what I'm talking about is what used to be called the West Bank.
Well, when we're referring to Israel and to Palestine, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, how big an area are we talking about?
Oh, it's a very small area. It's a lot smaller than I think a lot of people realize. If you were to take a map of Israel and superimpose it on a map of the state of Florida, and if you were to put the northernmost part of Israel over Jacksonville, the southernmost point of Israel would be in Fort Myers. So you're not talking about a very big area, and it's quite skinny as well, as far as that goes. But nevertheless, within its borders, there are lush forests, there's bleak deserts, there's bustling cities, there's very useful, productive farmland. It's a very, very diverse country. And so to the north, immediate north is Lebanon. To the northeast is Syria. To the immediate east is Jordan. To the southeast is Saudi Arabia. And to the southwest is Sinai and Egypt. So that and the Mediterranean Sea is directly west. Now, at the present time, fortunately, there is a peaceful coexistence with Jordan, for the most part, and Egypt. But all of the other countries are still very hostile toward Israel.
What are the various Islamist groups that we've been hearing about? Where are they located within that geography?
Yeah, that's a helpful question, because down in Gaza, where the current conflict seems to be most focused, that's where Hamas is located. And then to the immediate north in southern Lebanon, that's where Hezbollah is located. The Palestinian Authority are the ones that are trying to manage Judea and Samaria, or the former West Bank. The Houthis that you mentioned earlier are way over in Yemen. But behind it all is the state of Iran, who are pushing all of these groups. And of course, ISIS is also floating around wherever they can land. So they're still a presence as well. Now, I think it's important for all of us to recognize that all of these terrorist groups, if we're going to try to understand this conflict, all of these terrorist groups have dedicated themselves to the destruction of the state of Israel. And they have stated this publicly and in writing. This is their goal. And as I say, this is not just my opinion. This is their own stated goals publicly and in print. And they've never retracted to this. Now, the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, they have at times tried to be a moderating influence, but they're still extremists with them as well.
According to the Bible, the great spiritual ancestor of all Jews and Muslims and Christians, Abraham, was given the Holy Land by God himself some 4,000 years ago. But who owns this land that's in dispute? I mean, how can we make sense of who it really belongs to?
Yeah, that is a very large question, and it takes, we won't be able to cover the whole history today because it's quite complicated. But one thing that you might want to begin by recognizing that the Middle East is in such conflict because they function very much like a dysfunctional family. Those of you who've ever been part of a dysfunctional family know that sometimes that can seem very schizophrenic, and it's very, very complicated because all through the years since the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when the Romans pushed out the Jewish people, even though there's always been a Jewish presence in the land ever since then, but pushed most of the Jewish people out of the land, and the Christians for that matter, which really launched a lot of our evangelism to go out and plant churches and spread the gospel throughout the world. But ever since then, this area that we're talking about has been controlled by a wide variety of multiple powers. So after the Romans embraced Christianity, so the Byzantines were there. Various Muslim groups, various times have been there. The Crusaders were there. A group called the Mamluks. People usually have never heard of the Mamluks, but they were there. But for a very long period of time, the Turkish Ottoman Empire was in control of the area. And since they tended to support the wrong side in World War I, when that conflict was over, then the League of Nations gave the area that we're now talking about to be administered by the British and the French. So as we can see, there's been a wide variety of groups there. So to say, well, who in the world owns this land? Well, depends on what period of time we're talking about, doesn't it? Now, what happened then when the British were in control, when they had the mandate from the League of Nations to govern, since the late 19th century, well into the 20th century, Jewish people started to gradually migrate to the land and oftentimes purchased land from absentee Arab landlords until they really started building a Jewish community back in the nation of Israel. And now what I find very interesting is that when the League of Nations were trying to work on what would be a more long-term permanent solution to the Middle East, since it's such a diverse place, and there's a very large Jewish community there, there's a very large Arab community there. And after they established several Arab states, the decision about the area that we're now talking about was wherever there was a decidedly Jewish majority, that would become Israel. wherever there was a decidedly majority of Arabs, that would become Palestine. So their solution way back then was a two-state solution. Where have we heard that before? So after forming all these other Arab nations, the decision was that there would be a two-state solution. And so we're going to say more about this later. But if the problem in the Middle East is that people think this is the absence of a two-state solution, they could have had that from the very beginning. But every time that has been proposed, unfortunately, it's been the Arabs who have rejected it. And we'll say more about that later as we go along. By the way, I find it interesting that when the Jewish people were gradually moving into the area, and they were buying up this land from absentee Arab landlords, the land at the time was very desolate, mosquito-infested swamps. And very few people were living in it. It was a very small population. But with all the hard labor, the blood, sweat, and tears of the Jewish people, they transformed the land into very productive, useful farmland and really started building the place up and to build it up to be the nation of Israel that we have today. Now, perhaps it would be helpful, Doug, if we mention this word Zionism, because that's something that gets people really bent out of shape. So when we talk about who owns the land, what is this Zionism all about? Well, Zionism, the whole idea of Zionism developed over time, because we have to understand that since 70 AD, for these 2,000 years, the Jewish people have been guests in other people's countries. And they have been subject to all kinds of persecutions and so forth, which I believe we're going to talk about more later. And so what they started doing is saying, we really need our own land in order to be able to protect ourselves. So they gradually started migrating back to what they considered was their ancient homeland. And that's why so many Jewish people started moving into the area that we now call Israel. And it's a very similar attitude when the Jewish people decided they wanted to have their own nation, independent nation, very much like when the Europeans came to North America. And over time on the Eastern Seaboard, they say, hey, we need to have our own nation. And so that's when they appealed to the League of Nations and they came up with this two-state solution.
And after World War II, then the United Nations stepped in.
Yes, because now that's the continuation of the story, because after World War II, as a result of the Holocaust, that's a perfect example of how the Jewish people who are guests in somebody else's country didn't go very well, okay? And so more and more of them wanted to go to England, go to the United States, or I should say Great Britain and the United States, and many wanted to come to Israel. And the United Nations then confirmed what the League of Nations had decided to have a two-state solution. And so in 1947, the United Nations voted to create these two states. In 1948, the Israelis declared independence, and the next day they were attacked on all sides by 5 nations. And they fought then their war of independence.
And there were a lot of casualties during that war?
Well, this is true. Not only were there a significant number of Jewish casualties, but unfortunately, the Arabs that were living in the area, many were displaced. Now, they were displaced for 3 reasons, and we need to keep this in mind. Some left the area simply to avoid the military conflict, and you can understand that. There's a war going on, and so let's get out of the way. Other Arabs left because the Arab leaders encouraged them to leave and say, and after we destroy the Jews, then you can come back. Well, they didn't do that, so the people were stuck. They didn't come back. And then there were others that were, in fact, pushed out because they were thought to be combatants, or they're just the usual casualties of war, unfortunately. And so there was as many, these 3 different groups, there was as many as 700,000 Arabs that were displaced. But what people don't understand is at the same time, there were over 850,000 Jews who were expelled from Arab countries. But we never hear about that. because most of them were either absorbed into Israel or they went to Great Britain and the United States. But at the same time, there were many Arabs displaced. There were many Jews that were displaced from their countries of residence at the time. And I don't hear anybody suggesting that they should have the right of return as well. Many Arabs chose not to leave, but to remain in Israel during the War of Independence and beyond. Approximately 20% of the Arab population stayed. The descendants of those Arabs live in Israel to this day. There are 2 million or so Arabs, mostly Muslims, living in Israel today. They still make up around 20% of the total population of Israel.
Well, what accounts for some of the failed efforts to solve the so-called Palestinian problem in the recent past?
Well, that's another very large question. You're quite right. But it is important to keep in mind that the problem, again, does not stem from the absence of a two-state solution. To Westerners, a two-state solution makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Our viewers are probably thinking, well, that seems like a perfectly way to solve this problem. And as I said before, we could have had a two-state solution in 1947, because that was the original proposal, both by the League of Nations and the United Nations, because that's what was voted. And it was the Israelis who accepted it. Even though they didn't get as much land as they thought they were promised, nevertheless, they still accepted it. But it was the Arabs who rejected it. And so the two-state solution has repeatedly been proposed for decades by the United States and the Israelis, the United Nations, and every time it has been the Arabs who have rejected it. So I suggest that we get our brains around the idea that this is because the problem is not a two-state solution. The problem in the Arab mind is the existence of the state of Israel. Further, the problem is not the so-called occupation. We hear a lot about the Israelis have occupied. Well, the Israelis have remained in lands that they had to go into as a result of having been attacked repeatedly for 75 years. And evidence for this includes back in 2005, maybe you remember when Ariel Sharon was prime minister of Israel, and he made a unilateral decision to pull all the IDF troops out of Gaza, all of the settlers, the Israeli settlers that were living in Gaza. He forced them to move back to Israel. So you think, oh, wow, celebration. We no longer have an occupation in Gaza. When they pulled out, the rocket attacks against Israel dramatically increased. So I find it fascinating how often the Israelis have actually given back land that they went into when they have been attacked. So for instance, they've given Egypt the Sinai twice. I mean, who does that? I mean, who gives land back after a war, right? So the third thing that sometimes people are accusing the Israelis of is this supposed apartheid because of the security fence. And we have to understand that the Israelis hate the security fence also. They don't want it to be there. But the reason why it was built was to try to prevent terrorist attacks against Israel. And when they put up the security fence, the number of terrorist attacks against Israel declined dramatically. And so the solution is kind of simple. If you don't want this security fence, stop attacking Israeli citizens. The root problem is not the so-called occupation or the security fence or the absence of a two-state solution. From the opponents of Israel's mindset, it is the existence of the state of Israel. That is the problem. And that is why these terrorist organizations have made it absolutely clear that their goal is the elimination of the state of Israel and to decimate the Jewish population in the Middle East. They're the ones who have said this. This is not just my opinion. And that's why this phrase you've heard, from the river to the sea, what does that mean? That means the destruction of the state of Israel. Just like you hear or see on the news in Iran, there'll be a big protest, there'll be signs that say death to America. Well, from the river to the sea, these protesters that are quoting that, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, what that means is death to Israel.
What's contemporary Israeli society like?
Oh, yeah, that's a more positive subject than what we've been talking about. Israel is a very modern nation. And while antiquities abound, and those of you who have visited Israel have visited many of those places, and everywhere you look, you find antiquities. But I think Americans would feel, and Westerners in general, would feel very comfortable in Israel. And the hospitality is amazing. I mean, whenever I travel to Israel and I visit Christians and Muslims and Jewish people alike, I mean, I'm treated like a king. I mean, they're welcoming to me and to their homes, and they're very generous with their food and everything else. But one of the things that really strikes me about Israel culture is that they are world leaders. For such a tiny, tiny little country, they are world leaders in technology, medical research, in education, in the arts, and agriculture. And the world has really benefited greatly by this little country called Israel, by their inventions and the research that they have done. So I would suggest to all of you that all this boycott, divestment, and sanction, you've heard BDS, this is a bunch of nonsense. It's foolhardy, because Israel has blessed the world with so many modern conveniences and medical miracles that I suspect many people in our audience have benefited from.
Well, what are the current politics in Israel and in the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria?
Well, I would say, from my perspective, is that Israel, since it has been surrounded for 75 years, well, actually even longer, because there was a lot of conflict prior to the independence. But because Israel has been surrounded by hostile nations, committed to their destruction, Israelis have found themselves, by necessity, in a perpetual defensive mindset. I mean, they live with this daily. And so we've seen, even in the recent conflict and in years past, missiles flying into Israel. I mean, these people are living with this on a daily basis. And so to them, this is really an existential threat that it's just part of their life that they're under. And so this accounts for why the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is so strong and sophisticated and has been built up. But quite frankly, it also accounts for some of the mistakes that Israel has made that has aggravated the relations between Israel and the Palestinians. And sometimes you look at some of the things that happens and you go, "Oi, why would you do that?" But they're going to err on the side of security. And so this recent, you mentioned in your introduction, this security breach that caused October 7th. I firmly believe that a part of the reason why that was allowed to happen, or why it happened, was that the international community has been pressuring Israel so much to back off and not be so putting pressure on their neighbors, particularly the Palestinians. But as a result, that was an opportunity for Hamas to do what they did. And the Israelis are conscious of this. They know how to defend themselves, and we should allow them to do it. Now, as far as politics, as with all nations, Israeli politics are complicated and sometimes volatile. It's very different from ours in that when a nation is threatened, the politics are often set aside for the moment, and the nation really comes together in a measure of unity, and that prevails until the current threat ends. But in ordinary times, we have to recognize that in the Israeli Knesset, or their assembly, they might have as many as 16 or 17 parties represented. And so what has to happen is that when somebody's appointed to be prime minister, they have to be able to pull together a coalition out of all those very different political parties that are all there at once. By the way, there are Arabs in the Knesset. I'm not sure there's any Jews in any Arab country's assembly, but the Arabs are represented in the Israeli Knesset. That's still yet another party that is in that mix. So I think one of the biggest hot button issues, or two of them really, in Israel right now, the economy, with the war certainly, but even before this recent war, it's very expensive to live in Israel. And sometimes young professionals, both mom and dad are both employed. It's very hard to afford an apartment. So the Knesset has been wrestling with this for a very long time as to what to do about their economy. That's one thing. The other thing is at the moment, there's great disagreement about the authority of the High Court. So there's trouble with that. Now, regarding the Judea and Samaria, or what used to be referred to the West Bank, as we've already said, I've observed that the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, there have been times in which they've really tried to be a moderating influence. But they're in conflict with Hamas over the control of Gaza, because Gaza and the West Bank, originally that was Palestine. That was supposed to be, so we have a two-state solution. That would be what it is. But since Hamas took over Gaza, the Palestinian Authority is struggling with them for control. And so far, Hamas has overwhelmed them in their control. And you see the disaster that we have. So, but we must never forget that the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Hezbollah, all of these, backed by Iran, have all declared that their goal is the elimination of the state of Israel. Now, how are you supposed to negotiate with that?
In the final part of this Pastors Roundtable, we will address some of the issues relating to the broader conflict of the 21st century between radical Islam and the entire Western world. I hope you'll join us for that. This is Pastor Doug Pratt, Pastor Stephen Grant for the Life Academy.